Hey guys, and welcome to another video. Mr. Phillips. We've got a bit of a thunderstorm going on there, and my kids are going mental over there. So we'll see how well this goes. But we're going to be looking at how the environment can affect evolution today. So, just to introduce this, obviously we know about natural selection. We know all organisms reproduce, and normally populations will just increase until the size reaches something called a carrying capacity. And then it will remain stable. That's when you run out of either space, nutrients, or disease might limit it, and something else to happen. So this suggests that not all offspring will survive, because obviously if it did, the population would just continue to go up. And it can be something called an environmental resistance, can be biotic or abiotic. Okay, and what can happen is the population goes up, and then sometimes organisms overshoot, so then they'll collapse a bit, and then they'll level around this, what we call a carrying capacity, which is the top level that the environment can support for that organism. So let's have, what do we need to know? We need to understand that what obviously determines survival is the best adapted due to variation of alleles, which is called by mutations. The best adapted, the ones with the advantageous alleles, will survive and reproduce, and they will then pass on their genes to their offspring, and the genes will inherit that, will have a better chance of inheriting that advantageous allele, which will then pass on to their generation over generations and generations. That will cause things like the lion to get faster and the wildebeest to be able to escape more. So you get this evolution of the arms race effectively. We know that variation is important, and you see here's a good example that actually they've studied cheetahs in Africa, and they've realised that cheating female cheetahs actually have higher, healthier families. So the reason for this is basically if you've got scenario 1 and 2, if we look at scenario 2 first, if you've got a cheetah that has monogamous, which means that you have one partner for your lifetime, there'll be less variation, and if a new disease comes along and that you're susceptible to it, chances are the whole family is. Okay, if the female cheetah has several males though, and therefore the offspring come from several different males, one of them might be more susceptible to disease, but the others might be able to fight it off and not actually get ill as a result. So in terms of an example, then what can happen is that the environment can change, and that can cause your selection pressure to change. So if we have a look at this example here, it just says evolutionary change by the environment acting as an evolutionary force causes a change in allele frequency. So let's say here, let's imagine that these insects were first on a green leaf. It would be the green insect that would, or the leaves were green in the rainforest, let's say, that this insect would survive, the locust with the green allele, and the others would be less favourable. However, if the trees in the rainforest get replaced by a plant that's more brown and the leaves are more brown, then obviously they're going to stick out more for the animals that eat them, and therefore you might find that the brown ones survive more, and therefore what you see is the trend, the normal distribution curve shifts to a different advantageous allele. So you get different numbers. So it goes from the green to the brown. That's an example of the environment changing, which would cause a pressure change, a selection pressure change, changing the advantageous allele. And this has happened, really, this is your example of bacteria and antibiotic resistance. So what would have happened years and years ago before we started overusing antibiotics, obviously before we started using them artificially as humans, is that there would have been, most bacteria would have had maybe very little resistance to antibiotics because they weren't constantly being exposed to them, because humans only discovered them and started using them in the middle of last century. But because we've started using them all the time, and we've started to give them out too much even for illnesses that didn't even need them, bacteria got more and more exposed to them, and then the bacteria that did have some resistance started to survive and have an advantage of having that resistance gene. So those ones are the ones that started to survive, and the ones without resistance sort of died out and they didn't have the allele. So they've gone from being very little drug resistance to very high drug resistance because we've increased the amount of antibiotics being used in the environment. Whereas if you think about it, the environment, antibiotics were only discovered in the 1920s and only commercially used from the late 1940s, early 1950s. There were no antibiotics in the environment when bacteria infected us and pathogenic bacteria infected us. So in a way, we changed the environment, and then that has caused the evolutionary shift and the directional selection to antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Okay, now the other side of this is, what if nothing ever changes? What if the environment is so stable that the environmental factor basically doesn't ever change? Well, that means that you'll get less and less extreme versions of the insect. So let's say it's this middle green color now. Obviously, this leaf here this insect is best camouflaged. And if that never changed, this allele would slowly die out, and this allele would slowly die out. So you'd get lower and lower frequencies of the extreme. And what you'd get over time is you would get, if the population went from being changing quite a lot, the environment went from changing quite a lot to a very stable environment, you'd get from a wider line normal distribution to a thinner line normal distribution, where you'd get less and less extremes as a result of that, because the environment isn't changing. So there'd never be an advantage to having anything but that one middle colour, which is what obviously the majority would have, given us a line normal distribution. Okay, now that has actually happened, okay, and that has happened in humans, okay, and I don't think it's that the population, like the environment, massively changed, making it used to be one thing and now the other. But what has happened is, because conditions that we use to help babies be born have been sort of stabilised, if you think about healthcare across the world has improved. We now understand the best conditions for a baby to be born in, and we understand the best methods of giving birth that we're probably likely to do. We become more better at it. It's actually stabilised the selection of birth mass and the optimum birth mass. So babies used to be a much bigger variety of birth mass in the past. You used to have a lot heavier babies than you do nowadays, and also you'd have smaller babies that might have just about sort of survived. But what's happened over time is that, because the conditions haven't changed, the babies that are more likely to have survived in the past have become within a narrower range, and those ones then are more likely to pass on their genes into the future. So the birth mass of humans has dropped, like the range has dropped, and you can see why here. Okay, because you've got a lower mortality rate. So the red bit is the mortality rate. Okay, and you can see the mortality rate between the weight, which I'd say are the approximate norms. Let's say about 2.4 and I know 3.4 kilograms. That is where you have your lowest. It's less than 5% chance of infant mortality at that point. Whereas if you go to the outside, to the extremes, you're obviously going to have a massively increasing chance of infant mortality as the weight decreases, because obviously the baby won't be strong enough to survive birth. But then and a slight increase to the point of increase in mass, and obviously after a certain increase in mass, the baby wouldn't be able to be fit inside the lady's uterus, and therefore it wouldn't be survive to birth anyway. Okay, guys, so I hope that's useful. You need to know then that there's directional selection when the environment changes and it causes the alleles to be selected in a certain direction, or there's stabilizing selection when the environment doesn't change, and therefore your extremes get less and less common, and the narrower range of successful alleles happen. Okay, cheers, guys. See you soon.